Many people don't realize that the most harvested wild seaweed species in North America is rockweed, or Ascophyllum nodosum, which is the species name for this seaweed. And 80% of the wild harvested seaweed in the United States is rockweed from Maine shores. At the same time, agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service, and even the National Organic Standards Board, are all taking action to protect this seaweed species, the rockweed forest, as wildlife habitat. The difference between a harvested rockweed bed and a wild, virgin, uncut rockweed forest is best imagined if you think about a terrestrial forest and the difference between a virgin forest, an old growth forest, and a forest that's been managed for its biomass. The rockweed harvest industry basically is managing these beautiful seaweed beds to produce biomass that can then be taken to the factory and produced into fertilizer. Their interest is not in leaving these tall stands of rockweed trees, which you see behind me, for wildlife. I'm Robin Hadlock Seeley. I have a PhD in biology from Yale University, and I'm a certified senior ecologist through the Ecological Society of America. I'm also a co-founder of the Maine Rockweed Coalition and an 8th generation Mainer living in a very small town on Cobscook Bay in Maine, and that's in the USA. And I'm on the ancestral lands of the Passamaquoddy people here in Maine. I was born and grew up in Maine and grew up in a small town attending church as a child. But I have to say, after my childhood, I did not attend church and found a spiritual connection in nature. Some of the same feelings of spiritual connection I imagine that many people feel in a church or a synagogue or a mosque, I feel when I'm immersed in nature, and particularly when I'm immersed in nature at the coastline. I'm also lucky enough to live in a place with very low ambient light. So at night, I swear I can see the 9,000 stars that are visible to us here on Earth lighting up the sky overhead. And that's definitely a spiritual experience. Watching fish swim through the rockweed forest that I'm going to be talking about is definitely a spiritual experience. And this feeling of spiritual connection with the natural world is definitely a driver of my scientific work. And it also drives me towards this feeling of this notion of ecological justice or eco-justice, which is what this interview is about, where, quoting from Anna Wienhuis, her notion of ecological justice is that biodiversity conservation is not only a matter of securing the well-being of future human generations, but also a matter of doing justice to non-human living beings. And in essence, aiming for sustainability is not only something that we owe each other as fellow humans, but also something we owe other creatures with which we share this one planet. The way a sense of place plays the role in my scientific work and my habitat preservation work is the following. In order to ask good questions as a biologist, I need to understand the system, the ecological setting of what I'm actually studying. And because I've lived on the Maine coast for all of my 67 years, I'm pretty good at identifying what the important questions are. If I were in the tropics, it would be a different story, but I've spent a lot of time here. So if I'm asking questions about these underwater seaweed forests, I know who lives in those forests at high tide and who uses them at low tide. I started my scientific work on the Maine coast as a student at Bowdoin College, not working in the deep seas with scuba gear, but working in the intertidal zone, which is the area in between where the high tide reaches on the land and where the low tide reaches. So that area of the coast that's covered up at high tide and uncovered at low tide. And I started working on a very common Maine snail and looking to its response to crab predators in tide pools. And the question was, do snails run away from crabs? And how could this possibly be? Because snails move really slowly. The answer is that even though they move really slowly, they do respond to the crab predators. And while the crab is busy eating one snail, the other snails can slowly move away and disperse from that area. I then moved on to studying a related snail species that has been on the Maine coast for thousands of years. And I would like to tell the story in some detail because it's the reason for my mission in protecting the seaweed forest. The story is kind of a sad one because it ends with the eradication of the snail, but that's also an important part of the story. It's just a common snail. It's not a very exotic snail, but it lived here. It was definitely here at the time of when the Passamaquoddy people were the only people here. And it was here when the colonists arrived from Europe. It's a small yellow snail. And when the colonists that came here first described it in European terms, they called it Littorina palliata, and it looked a very particular way with a pointed spire on it, a pointed top, and it was a very fragile shell. And to tell a very quick history of this snail, it gradually became eliminated from the shoreline of Maine around the late 1800s as this predatory crab, which was introduced from Europe, gradually began to move north along the coast. And my PhD dissertation was studying the process of how this form of snail was eliminated in response to crabs moving into one area after another, and what the interaction was between the snail and its predator crab that caused it to change its shape from one form into another. So today we have mostly the new form, the much flatter and rounder form, whereas in the 1800s and earlier, for thousands of years, it had a very sharp pointed top. So this was what I was studying as a snail biologist and an evolutionary ecologist. And my work became focused on the area where I now live, Cobscook Bay, because the older form that was here in the 19th century still persisted in Cobscook Bay. Probably part of the reason that it persisted in Cobscook Bay, well, one reason is it didn't have very many of the predatory crabs, but also it had these vast, beautiful virgin forests of rockweed, which is the species of seaweed that you see behind me in the slide, which forms these beautiful rockweed underwater forests. So one day in the late 1990s, we suddenly saw these blue boats coming into Cobscook Bay and cutting down the rockweed forest with sharp blades on a rake, multiple boats. And we learned that it was from a company in Canada that had been harvesting this seaweed for agricultural use and had now decided to come across the border and harvest it from the state of Maine. And because Cobscook Bay is on the Canadian border, Cobscook Bay was the first place that this company came to get the rockweed, to cut the rockweed, to take it back to their factory in Canada and process it into agricultural products. And at the time, I remember being so shocked that something as important and critical as this underwater habitat could be simply mowed down, cut down, and taken to a factory for processing when everyone knows how important this habitat is to the coastal environment, to the ecological community, to biodiversity here in Cobscook Bay. Cobscook Bay used to be a biodiversity hotspot. And it was just unbelievable to me that this was happening. And so in that moment, my goal shifted from being a basically a snail evolutionary ecologist to an ecologist that was trying to spend most of her time at that point protecting these rockweed forests. As it turned out, the snail that I studied, this Littorina species, is the primary bycatch species for the seaweed harvesters. And by bycatch, I mean they don't mean to take the snail, but inevitably, in cutting the seaweed and dropping it into the bottom of the boat, because the snail requires this seaweed to live on, that's its obligate habitat, by removing the seaweed, they're also removing the snail. So fast forward, we're now in 2022. That was decades ago. That snail is almost completely eliminated from Cobscook Bay, where it had flourished for thousands of years. Part of the reason is that it's been the bycatch for this commercial rockweed industry. The other reason is that because of warming ocean temperatures, which we as humans are also responsible for, the predatory crab has flourished, and whatever the rockweed industry has not taken as bycatch, the predatory crab has finished off. So a snail that persisted in this area where I live for thousands of years is now virtually gone. Rachel Carson, the well-known conservation biologist who is probably most famous for writing the book Silent Spring, but she was also a marine biologist, was the first person to write about rockweed as an underwater forest and recognize its critical role in the ecosystem. And I could quote from a really great article that Ben Goldfarb wrote in Hakai magazine explaining how she went about this. And he wrote, "No intertidal dweller captured Carson's imagination like Ascophyllum nodosum, which is rockweed, a rubbery, olive-colored, ubiquitous macroalgae known widely on the Atlantic coast as rockweed. The biologist was most enchanted by rockweed's double life, how its identity changed with the tides. When the ocean withdrew from the Maine beach, she noted the seaweed lay limp, and when the tide returned, the submerged plants stood erect, quote, rising and swaying with a life borrowed from the sea, unquote. The diversity of these undersea jungles, whose canopies sometimes stretched taller than 2 meters, enthralled Carson. Quote, small fishes swim, passing between the weeds, as birds fly through the forest. Sea snails creep along the fronds, and crabs climb from branch to branch, she wrote, unquote. So when we talk about what the rockweed forest does for the environment, it includes the following bullet points. 150 different species use it, everything from small mysid shrimp or amphipods up to juvenile cod and pollock and other kinds of other species of commercial fish. Another point is that it forms, as it rises, as you can see behind me, it forms this three-dimensional habitat. And so, like kelp beds and kelp forests on the west coast of the United States, we term it an ecosystem engineer. So it's really important as an ecosystem engineer. Another point is that it's a very old forest. So rockweed forests can be up to hundreds of years old. Not the fronds necessarily, not the part of the plant that looks like the tree trunk, but the holdfast, the part of the plant from which the fronds grow, can be centuries old. So we're talking about a very, very ancient old forest. And also, it's very slow to regrow. So unlike some kelp species that you've probably heard about that can grow up to a centimeter a day, these rockweed forests are very slow growing and take a long, long time once they're cut to develop back up to their full height. Another reason the rockweed forest is so important is that it has multiple ecosystem connections. It functions as shelter and as food and supports these low trophic level species that are low in the food web, and they support the species that are high, have a higher trophic level, that are higher in the food web, like fish. So, as an example, it it forms shelter for these mysid shrimp, which are important winter food for groundfish, and the snails that crawl on its fronds are food for black ducks in the winter, critical food for them. It also plays a role in the ecosystem in various stages of its life history, from maturity through to death. When it's live and attached, as you see behind me, it forms this shelter and food and a spot for these species to be sheltered and eat. But also when it's detached, it will wash up on the shore and form rack lines along the beach, these rows of decaying seaweed. And that's a really important place for shorebirds, who are now threatened and decline, to find small insects and others and small crustaceans that they can feed on. And oftentimes those are places where the shorebirds stop and feed before they make their nonstop journeys, either going north to the Arctic or south to South America. So what looks like just a dead bunch of seaweed on the beach is actually an important feeding place for shorebirds. And then finally, sometimes the fronds break off and float out to sea and form these rafts that are floating on the surface of the water. Those are also places where fishes can come and find habitat underneath. And then seabirds like puffins will come to these seaweed patches of floating rockweed and feed there. And then finally, for humans, from a human point of view, speaking of climate change and our worries about our changing climate, these vast rockweed beds are really important as for their carbon absorption, like a terrestrial, just like a terrestrial forest. And for that reason, it's important to keep that climate mitigation function intact. But also, it forms a physical barrier, well, not a barrier, but um, a living vegetation system which buffers the effect of the increasing storm surges that we're getting from increasing storm activity. And that helps prevent the high rate or mitigate the high rate of erosion that we're now seeing on our shores as rising sea levels and increasing storms pound away at our shoreline. So those are two ways that the rockweed also serves an important function, just speaking in terms of its help to us humans. It's important to protect it because it supports the nearshore ecosystem in so many ways. Commercial fisheries are important. Commercial fisheries are dependent on it. Juvenile lobsters are sheltered by it, and in the strong sun of the summer and the icing of the winter, the important clam flats around here are protected by these long lengths of rockweed at low tide, serving as a temperature buffer for clams. So if we are interested in preserving the biodiversity of the marine environment, whatever is left to us, we need to protect this seaweed forest as a sustainer of marine and coastal biodiversity and life. I remember just a year ago when I was sitting on a shore and I noticed for the first time that terns were diving into the forest, actually plunge diving. They are coming over, scouting for fish, and then suddenly plunging straight into the canopy of the forest, which is half floating at mid tide. and feeding there. I need to say something about how this rockweed is being used commercially. It's harvested on the coast, piled up into boats or into bales, and then sent to a processing factory where it is usually dried, and then it's used to create agricultural products. So sometimes it's put into agricultural feed, and sometimes it's made into what are called biostimulants to spray on crops to increase root growth, I think. So its primary purpose is in agricultural use. And when it's harvested to be sent to a factory, the value that is put on it is about 5 cents per pound for its biomass. That just means a pound of rockweed sitting on a dock somewhere getting ready to go to the factory is worth about 5 cents a pound. Of course, its ecological value, I would say, is a value that can't even be calculated. So in the goal of preserving biodiversity lies the conflict between the commercial harvesters of the seaweed forest, this rockweed forest, and the people like me who are trying to protect it, and the 150 species that use it and depend on it. So our overarching question is, do we look at the rockweed forest as a single commodity with a commercial value of 5 cents a pound, sitting in the bottom of a boat or sitting on a dock somewhere? Or do we value it as an essential foundation of a complex coastal community which supports that community? Let's take the commodity view. So that's a view of sustainable biomass. And this is what the seaweed industry does when it claims that the harvesting that it's doing is sustainable. And they say that because what they mean is they can cut it down and the biomass at some point will return, and then they can cut it down again. And that's what I call commercial sustainability. The other kind of sustainability is more of an ecological community view, which is ecological sustainability. And that means sustainable ecological community function. So you could remove some part of the rockweed forest, and after a certain amount of time, the function of that forest would return. If that activity is sustainable, then you have ecological sustainability. Ecological sustainability, as it's defined on land by the U.S. Forest Service, means the maintenance of the composition, structure, and processes of ecosystem, including the diversity of plant and animal communities. So my guiding principle throughout these 25 years of protecting the rockweed forest is that the appropriate sustainability goal to use with an ecosystem engineer like the rockweed forest is ecological sustainability and not commercial commodity sustainability. So this means we need to maintain the diversity of plant and animal communities in the rockweed forest, that is, what we have left. And the best way to do that is to leave the forest alone as a sustainer of ecosystem functioning. And this is not divorced from the health of human communities, because when the natural world is sustained, the human world is better sustained. When the rockweed forest is protected, the commercial species that depend on it are also protected, and the fishermen that depend on these species and all the related economic activity that goes along with that on the coast from those fisheries is also protected. And I have to say that many fishermen intuitively understand this and understand the protection of the rockweed forest. And on the Maine Rockweed Coalition website, there are interviews with local fishermen talking about their understanding of how important these seaweed forests are for protecting what they do. Back in 2007 and 2008, when those of us in communities around Cobscook Bay were trying to figure out how we could protect Cobscook Bay, its fishermen, and its fisheries from the extraction of rockweed by the Canadian company that was working here at the time, we decided that one thing we could do is try to pass a law in our state legislature that would increase protections for rockweed, at least in Cobscook Bay. If we couldn't do it statewide, we would try to do it here in Cobscook Bay. And so we started to mobilize support for a bill that a legislator put forth at the legislature in 2008. And after a lot of struggle, that ended up in a law in 2009 that actually has an additional layer of protection for rockweed forests in Cobscook Bay by itself, just this one bay. And so gathering support from all around Cobscook Bay, different communities, was very important, as you can imagine, to getting that bill passed in the state legislature. And one of the first communities to support that bill was the Passamaquoddy community of Zibayak, and their Passamaquoddy Tribal Council at Zibayak actually passed a resolution that recognized the importance of the rockweed forest and banning commercial rockweed harvesting from their shores by tribal members, but and outside tribal members of the community outside the tribe. So that was very important in helping us get that bill passed at the legislature. Unfortunately, in a way, it's unfortunate that courts have had to get involved, but the courts have played a role in the protection of rockweed because of the unusual property ownership system that we have in Maine, which is related to the fact that Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. And I think it's interesting to look at the role that the courts have played in this. So in Maine, as in Massachusetts, the tidal zone from the high tide mark to the low tide mark, which is considered public in many other states, is actually private property in the state of Maine. So that private landowners own the intertidal zone where the rockweed grows from the high tide mark to the low tide mark. So the intertidal zone is privately owned, but the public has the ability to do three things in the intertidal, and those are called public trust rights. Those public trust rights include fishing, fowling, F-O-W-L-ing, and navigation. So those are called the public rights. You can go there to fish, you can go there to fowl, whatever that means, but I think it means hunting birds, and to navigate. And the rockweed extraction industry, the seaweed industry, that the people that are coming to cut the rockweed and take it away, had always claimed that they had the right to be there in the intertidal zone taking away the seaweed because they were actually fishing. And the reason they said they could count as fishers, even though they were taking vegetation, was because they did it from a boat. So that was basically the argument. And so they would come and just take the seaweed away, not ask permission of the landowner, because they considered it fishing, part of the public trust, their ability to be there as a member of the public through the public trust right of fishing. And the landowners on the other side had said for years that seaweed is not a fish, and so you cannot be considered fishing. So as you can imagine, this argument raged back and forth until finally there was a recognition that it was going to need a court to straighten this out. So in 2015, seaweed was cut from the property of a friend of mine called Ken Ross, and he was also an ardent protector of the rockweed. And he also had a conservation easement from a land trust on his property. So his property was supposedly protected for conservation by this easement. And also he was of the opinion that because seaweed is not a fish and so cutting seaweed cannot be considered fishing, that he owned the rockweed. So he sued a Canadian company, the Canadian company that had been in Cobscook Bay for many years, called Acadian Sea Plants. And the case is called Ross v. Acadian Sea Plants. And that was the landmark case in rockweed protection and rockweed ownership, because after appeals and 4 years of going through the courts, the Maine Supreme Court issued the decision in March 2019 that rockweed on the intertidal shore is the property of the landowner, and that seaweed is not a fish, which didn't come as news to most of us, but it took 4 years to get there. This case is super important because what it means is that landowners now had a property rights tool to conserve the seaweed. That meant that if a harvester wanted to cut down the seaweed forest, he had to first approach the landowner to ask permission to do that, in the same way that on land, if you have a terrestrial forest and someone wants to cut down your trees, they're not just going to come and do it, hopefully. They're going to come and ask your permission, or you're going to work out some arrangement where they cut your trees, you get a certain fee percentage of that called stumpage. And so the system in the coastal environment would work the same as it does in the terrestrial environment. You own this rockweed forest, you own your terrestrial forest, and people can't just come and take it without your permission or without paying you anything. So that meant the whole system shifted from this being a publicly available resource that anyone could take and put it in private ownership. Or it always had been in private ownership, but the court clarified that it was in private ownership. So that meant we have now another tool in our conservation toolbox, which is teaching landowners the importance of this rockweed, and that they now have the legal ability to say no if someone approaches them and asks for permission to take the rockweed. The other role that the court has played, or is going to play soon, is to clarify and to strengthen this 2019 decision, because right now I and a few other landowners are being personally sued by the rockweed industry for taking the Maine Supreme Court decision seriously that they own the rockweed. So landowners are being sued because they called the marine version of the police when their rockweed was stolen off their property. And I'm being sued for informing landowners that they have this right. So this is a second lawsuit, which is currently underway, and we await the court's decision on this. What brings me hope in bringing awareness of these issues to the public is that more and more landowners are aware of the importance of these underwater forests that they actually own, and are really dedicated to protecting them, whether it's because they love the shorebirds that visit their shore every spring and fall, or because they like to fish, or because they just don't see the sense of extracting something so critical to the Maine coast and the Maine economy. What also brings me hope is a changing national attitude, I think, about 19th century style resource extraction. For example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is very focused right now on protecting rockweed in our coastal national wildlife refuges in Maine. There's a lot of islands and a lot of acreage right now that belong to federal national wildlife refuges here on the coast of Maine. And now rockweed removal from federal shores is a federal crime. Similarly, more and more coastal land trusts are taking an active role in this by not allowing commercial rockweed harvests on their conserved lands. And another example is that NOAA has recently designated rockweed beds as essential fish habitat, which is a technical term, essential fish habitat for juvenile cod, which means it gets a slight amount more of protection that way. And even at USDA, the National Organic Standards Board, after 5 years of study and discussion, recently voted to recommend much stricter standards for rockweed and other seaweeds that are being used in agriculture producing products with the organic label. So that was a real achievement. At the Maine Rockweed Coalition, we try to bring home the message about what these forests do by posting underwater video and other videos of other kinds of species, like the various bird species that use the forest. We always welcome members of the public joining the Maine Rockweed Coalition. And I have to just say at this point, I'm doing this interview not as a spokesperson for the Maine Rockweed Coalition, but as myself as a scientist. But I am a board member of the Maine Rockweed Coalition. So I urge everyone to visit the website of the Maine Rockweed Coalition, which is Maine Rockweed Coalition, all one word, .org, or email the Maine Rockweed Coalition at maine.rockweed@gmail.com. And finally, I just want to return to the definition of ecological justice, which I started this with which I started this interview, and remind everyone that in aiming for sustainability, it's not only something that we owe each other as fellow humans, but also that we owe these other creatures with which we share this one planet, including all the creatures that depend on the rockweed forest.